really, improving your vocabulary is the same as anything else. And like my advice is always focus on larger blocks of English and chunks of English. But, building vocabulary is also a good thing to do. It just shouldn't be the primary focus. But it should be done in exactly the same way as I've taught you throughout the course. Data-driven learning. Start with real samples of English, whether they are optimized, materials designed for people learning English, just like what you've got in Extraordinary English Speakers, whatever you're using. Start with real samples of English and then aim to understand everything in context. Now, a big part of that is going to be looking at the chunks and the way that, people actually block their language and construct the dialogue in that kind of way. But of course, there are going to be words in there that you don't know as well. Learn those words, learn them in context, find out what chunks those words collocate with. Because it's really impossible to truly understand a word with the exception of perhaps, very, very concrete nouns. Like, the word dog is, it's always pretty much going to be dog. I mean, you don't really need to know the collocations of dog to understand what a dog is. But something like the word cause is impossible to understand unless you know that cause is chunked together with things like cause a problem, cause an accident, but never positive things like cause a success. So that's how I really recommend it. You focus more on the actual chunks that these words appear in than anything else. But really, vocabulary learning is just done alongside what we've done in the course. Use data, learn from context. Remember that less is more, as we talked about in week 4. Just learning more vocabulary very rarely makes sense. Avoid list learning because it's just not how the brain works. Remember, the mind is a network, and unless you're actually kind of learning in context, really integrating those words into that network, they just get forgotten. The problem with list learning is that you can remember it in the context of the list, but that's it. And it doesn't really work in any other kind of way. And it also depends on what kind of vocabulary you mean and what you're doing as well. So vocabulary learning often is going to be type 2 language. And if you've got like a specific thing that you need to learn vocabulary for, this is when things like, for example, and the example that I always give is, the bike shop example, going to a shop to buy a bike. Well, if you don't know what a chain is, if you don't know what a pannier is, if you don't know what are they called, drop handle is, then, or a chainstay. Vocabulary learning is definitely better done, I think, for type 2 language in specific topics when you've got something to talk about. Whereas if we're talking about more general learning, you're going to be better off focusing on larger blocks of English, focusing on type 1 stuff. It depends on the goal and what you're doing. Does that answer your question?